most important and discussed topics within writing pedagogy. Up until now, we have discussed learning styles and how we should keep the diverse learning styles in mind to set up the writing process within our courses and assignments. Just as it is important to know what type of writing function we want to use in our course and assignment, similarly, it is important to know when to use which type of feedback depending on the assignment, the level of the student, and our own expectations from the student. We all have encountered feedback in different forms and styles as students or even as professionals. If you reflect back at all the feedback that you have received, you might notice that sometimes feedback was easy to implement because it was not asking for a lot of changes or it was phrased in a clear manner. Other times, the feedback was probably impossible to work with because it was asking too much, or maybe it was not clear about what it wanted you to change. Maybe while it pointed out the gaps and issues and asked you to make changes, it failed to show you how to actually do that. Other times, the tone in which the feedback was delivered to us also affected our ability to engage with it. It is with this diverse and shared experience that each of us has had with feedback that we will look at feedback specifically within writing assignments and courses. In this module, the conversation will revolve around understanding that what is feedback within a writing assignment, the different ways we give feedback, and what are the components or characteristics of feedback that makes it effective. This broader conversation around these three aspects will help us understand and fine-tune our own approach to feedback. So often, the tutor gives robust feedback, engaging with each and every line of the text, putting the heart and soul in the feedback, and still the student is unable to implement it, and the tutor feels frustrated by the lack of engagement from the student side. In effect, what is happening is that because of the sheer volume of the comments, the student is unable to implement the feedback given to them. In other documented cases, we see the student is frustrated by the lack of engagement with the text because, barring maybe marking 3 things and language errors, the student has received no feedback on actually how to go about reworking the text. This ability to distinguish between what is an important error to flag, what is a tertiary concern, and what are the things to point out in order to give a holistic feedback, it comes from our understanding of what is our own intention and expectation from the feedback that we are giving to students and the different types of feedback. If the feedback that we give students is asking them to resolve, say, 60 comments in an hour and submit final, means that we have not considered the actual amount of time student needs to meaningfully engage with our feedback. In this module, we will discuss some of the practical strategies that we as tutors can implement when we are giving feedback, especially to a larger group of students, so that each student is able to make the most of their feedback. This also includes identifying needs of each draft and tailoring our feedback to the draft. One of the biggest challenges is students have template-like writing, but this is often a result of a template-like feedback that we as tutors give almost mechanically and fail to see the individual student, their style behind individual drafts. Another common type of feedback that most tutors do is read and respond to the text intuitively. Responding to the text as an intuitive reader is not an inherently bad thing, as this type of engagement can be brought into discussion to help students realize the gaps or logical jumps in their writing. For example, by saying, as a reader, I am confused here because you are suddenly talking about the need of bridge construction in a paragraph which is focusing on columns. This helps the student to see how their writing is being perceived by the readers. However, when we give feedback intuitively, oftentimes we end up focusing on the language or completely sidestepping the requirements of the rubric. For an experienced editor, intuitive feedback might work because it is backed by years of reading and editing experience with varied texts. But for young new tutors, doing intuitive feedback often defaults to language editing, fixing grammar and syntax, as language errors are the easiest to spot. For us to give intentional feedback, it is important that we are more purposeful and intentional about the issues or errors that we flag and the reason behind it. This clarity about what we want the student to change, fix, or improve stems from clarity about what is it that the individual writer wants to say through their draft, what is the main point that they want to convey. So often, tutors bring their own impressions and how they think they would write the draft, and the feedback ends up asking for things that changes the essence of the draft itself. With the focus on the core point that the student wants to convey, the feedback can prioritize the issues in the draft. These core issues of improvement that are flagged in feedback also align with the detailed rubric of the assignment and its genre specification. In essence, intentional feedback is more planned and time effective. Even with our intention of feedback in place, there are various types of feedback. Each type of feedback has a specific rationale and purpose. Ideally, every draft should have a good balance of these types of feedback, but their ratio depends on the student learner and their individual skill level. Finally, the development Even with our intention of feedback in place, there are various types of feedback. Each type of feedback has a specific rationale and purpose. Ideally, every draft should have a good balance of these types of feedback, but their ratio depends on the student learner and their individual skill level. For instance, direct corrections which directly fix the errors in the draft is required to show students once what we want them to do. Doing this once for repetitive errors is good, but if the entire feedback only contains direct corrections for the student might accept these changes but will not gain the skills to identify the errors in future drafts. Another style of feedback is directive feedback. This type of feedback provides clear instructions regarding the change that needs to be made. For example, a comment saying, add a transition line here. This would help the student improve the draft quality by directing them specifically what needs to be done. But this can work only when, at least in few places, the direct instructions are followed by explanation or rationale of why the student has to do it. It is with a combination of instruction with explanation that the student will be able to see why something is not working in the draft and what are the ways in which they can fix an issue like this. One of the things that as tutors we want the students to reach is a place to think for solutions on their own instead of always providing them with solutions. Here, asking students guiding questions encourages them to see the flaws, gaps in the writing or in their thinking and come up with the solutions on their own. This style of feedback encourages student autonomy. Finally, the developmental feedback that focuses on developing the core argument and logic of the draft uses a combination of all the types of feedback for from directing to guiding questions to providing direct solutions and to scaffolding learning. All these choices of when to give which type of feedback are made based on the specific student type or the student learner. Even before we start giving feedback, it is important for us to engage with the student text as it is so that we are able to identify what they are trying to convey. This is sometimes challenging to do as the initial drafts are not always clean and coherent and requires us tutors to pay a little more attention to identify the core meaning that the student wants to convey. Here are some steps that we can employ when we are engaging with the student drafts. In order for us to understand the student text, it is important that we read the text and only the text. This act of reading also happens at two levels. We read as readers, and second, we read as tutors. In both these levels of reading, our intention is slightly different. Our first read, reading as readers, focuses on reading and understanding the text. What is the text trying to say, and are there any places where we are confused or the readability is affected? The second read, reading as a tutor, is a closer read. This is where we are reading as tutors to identify patterns and repeat issues. Based on the expectations of the assignment, we make suggestions that still retain what the student is trying to say. Through suggestions and explanations, we show students ways to fix the issues. And finally, we do a third read. This is to review the comments that we have given to ensure that only the core important issues are prioritized that will help the student improve the overall quality of the draft. We remove any of the excessive comments that are unnecessary depending on the draft stage that the student is working at. After we have read to understand the student intention and rationale behind the choices, and also analyze the text to identify repetitive errors, it is important to pay close attention to our tone and register and length of comments that we leave. This module will expand on the types of feedback and how do we go about making active choices to make our feedback more intentional and effective. Using the existing theories, you will learn the practical strategies to give effective feedback and how to make the feedback more student-centric.